Hey there, this is a time lapse of a build of a gaming and dining table. My parts list, plans, and sketches are linked below. So you start by cutting 2x4s for the undercarriage. Two of them are 6 feet 10 and 3/4 inches. Two of them are 2 feet, and you miter the long ones by 45 degrees. You also will cut 8 2x4s to 8 and 1/8 inches. Those are the outer stiles, and you'll miter those by 45 degrees as well. You're going to cut the plywood, 3/4 ply, to be 6 feet and 3 feet, and then you're going to put the stiles there, as you can see. The long ones go across, the two short ones go in the middle, and then the small ones stick out over the sides, as you'll see in the sketches. You can attach those with self-driving wood screws, all that kind of thing. You want to make sure it's centered up nicely. It looks like that. You notice that those are all mitered 45 degrees. I also cut at this time the cubes we'll be talking about later, but we'll talk about those in a moment. So you just sketch out where it belongs on the plywood. Again, I started with a 4x4 piece of plywood, which I cut down to 4x3, leaving me with some extra, which I cut to make those additional pieces. There's that 4x3. There are those additional pieces of ply. Make sure everything is perfectly square, and then you can just screw it right down into it. You want to make sure that the screws are completely flush or countersunk below the level of the plywood, because any irregularity in the top is going to be an irregularity in the play surface there. As I said, I also had cut earlier the cubes which go on the sides, because those come out of 2x4s as well. 8 of those are going to be just 4-inch cubes. 6 of those are just regular 4-inch cubes. 8 of those are 4-inch cubes that you've also shaved an inch off of. So instead of 3.5 inches wide, they're 2.5 inches wide. You'll see what that is in a moment. This is me cutting the legs. You'll need 4 of each. These are 2x4s, so 26.5 inches and 23 inches. And each of those pairs you see forms one of the legs. You want to make sure that they're pretty darn precise so they don't wobble. I think I'm recutting one of them right now to make sure they are precise. This I'm doing here with a router is something you do not have to do, but makes everything look nicer. This is just cutting a lark's tongue groove on the outside. You just put a 3/4 cove bit into the router. You clamp off an inch on either end of it so that the router can't dig there, and it just automatically digs in and on each end makes this beautiful little groove. Just makes it look a lot more like furniture rather than just square pieces of wood stuck together. I'll show you some pictures of that later on. There's a lot of stuff I do with the router on this table. It's just decorative. You can skip all of that. Once you've done that, you screw those together. You always want to screw from the long side into the short side, so the short side doesn't have any screw heads on it, because it's the long side that will be facing back. Then you clamp them onto the table, so short side out, long side back, so they're nice and solid there into the undercarriage. You drill through with a 5/16 inch drill, and then you can use 5/16 inch 4-inch bolts to hold it on. You do want to use hex bolts so you can get them nice and tight so there's not a bit of wobble. I'm also drilling a 1-inch hole in the middle of each of the undercarriage sides to run the power cables later. So that's what that looks like when you've got the undercarriage, the plywood top. Those are those lark's tongue grooves I put on there. They're just decorative, but they sort of make having everything sort of planned out in advance. Those are the hex bolts there, because there's just it's a lot of work here. So now I'm doing the walls on the inside of the vault. This is 1x4 pine, and of course 1x4 is not really 1x4. It's actually 3/4 by 3.5. It's something just to keep in mind through all these dimensions because they're pretty specific. You're going to cut 2 of those pieces to 6 feet. Those are the long walls, and 2 of the pieces to 3 feet 9.5 inches. Then you're going to you're going to mark them against where those stiles stick out, and then you're going to cut a 1-inch notch into each of those where the stiles stick out, so they rest right on those stiles on the side. Makes it a much more stable table than the earlier tables I've made. Once you've done that, and you see I'm working with a square this whole time, you want to make sure everything is very squared up as you go. I'm also cutting a little notch in the very middle of these, again, just to make the wiring for the electrics a little bit easier. It's not necessary. And then the one corner of them, the right-hand corner of the board that you see there, I cut a little triangle or notch out of that corner for the running of the LEDs as well. And there you see I'm just screwing in these, again, just self-driving 1 3/4 inch wood screws. Just screw those into the plywood itself there. You want to be very slow and careful with that so nothing breaks. You might use a nail gun instead. It's up to you, but you do want to be careful if you're using the drill, making sure, again, everything is completely level as you go. And you'll end up with these walls that are seated on those stiles that stick out. The short walls sort of extend past the long walls, and now what you see, I've added those cubes that I cut earlier. You can see them sticking out of the sides. The short ones sit on top of those stiles, and the long ones are independent there. You can sort of see them there. They are screwed through from the wall side, and they're going to support the facing, which I'm cutting now, and the top that goes on top of that. I used oak for the facing. It's a little trickier to work with, but it's awfully pretty. I had a friend of mine who I made the table for actually gave me the oak, him and family, but otherwise it's pretty expensive. The facing is going to be, again, 1x4. You're going to cut 2 of those pieces to 3 feet 11 inches and 2 of those pieces to 6 feet 11 inches. There's a picture again of those cubes. And then you're going to mark in the middle of each of those long faces the position for a socket. You're also going to miter, you see me marking those there, you're going to miter the edges by 45 degrees. That's why a miter saw is really necessary for this. And that is, you're going to miter them through the thickness of it. So when those fit together around the edges, they make a nice mitered edge. I'm cutting the holes for the electrical sockets. The easiest way I found is to drill into the corners with a 1-inch drill or 5/16 drill, and then put in your jigsaw and just cut the sides out. Makes a couple nice little squares for the electrical sockets to go. Those just go in the middle of those long edges. You can see, because I've mitered those sides, how neatly they fit together there on the edge. Then you're going to hold them up against those cubes, make sure everything is sized up properly. You're going to use some clamps to glue them onto the faces of those cubes, and use a nail gun. You want to make sure the nail gun is deep enough that it sinks the heads a little bit below the surface of the wood. Notice as I'm going through, I'm having to do some resizing and recutting. That is likely going to happen. I'm very much an amateur woodworker. If you're an expert at this, you may not need to resize things. It may things be a bit more precise for you, but for me, this is only the third of these tables I've built, and so I'm still very much learning in that process, so I'm having to make some adjustments. But again, you use a nail gun, and they go right onto those cubes. You can see on the long sides there's 4 cubes, and the short sides there's 3 cubes. 2 on each side are on those stiles that come out. Now I'm sizing up the tops. This is 1x6. Again, I used oak. But you can use pine, you can use whatever. Oak is nice because you can carve into it a little bit easier. I'm just making sure everything is cut to the right length based on the table. Ideally, these should be 6 feet 11 inches for the long side and 3 feet 11 inches on the short side, but you want to make sure it's very precise to your table. Then you're going to miter, as you see, 45 degrees along the surface, the 6-inch surface of that. So that those, again, form nice miters as they're set onto the top of the table. You're not going to attach them quite yet. We've got some other stuff to do, but you do want to make sure that they are all cut and mitered precisely so that they fit neatly around, sitting on the top of those cubes there, because that's going to be the play surface for the table itself. See how they sort of fit there. I'm just making sure all the miters are correct. That's, again, if you're a really great woodworker, this is probably just perfect for you. I had to make some different adjustments to make sure that all the miters were right. Now I'm tracing the cup holders onto the table. I also made a template for the dice trays. You'll see that it's made of cardboard, and it was really nice once I had the templates for both the cup holder and the dice trays. It was easy because I could mark where the centers were, and then you can see them there. They're just cardboard, and it was made it easy for cutting those and routering those. So when it comes to the cup holders, there's two ways to do it. One way is to drill holes sort of around where you've drawn those and then use a jigsaw to cut that. Certainly with oak, that's really tricky. It took me forever because I had to keep making adjustments to use the jigsaw to cut these cup holders. The easier way that you'll see me do with the rest of them, if you have a router, is to do that. You'll use a straight bit on the router. You'll mark it to cut through about half the depth, so about a half of inch, and just trace around that circle that you drew. Then you'll lower it the rest of the way and cut the way through. And as you saw, it's much faster to cut that one. So that you'll see that's the method I use for the rest of these cup holders. You don't necessarily want to cut through in one go because it'll burn and it might seize up. So instead you have the depth for about half of it, that's about an inch, and then you lower it the other quarter of an inch to dig all the way through on a second pass. So just making multiple passes. 2 passes was about right. You notice there's a lot of sawdust that gets created. That's going to happen if you use the router. It's still a great tool. You might want to watch some videos on use of router if you're not used to using them, because I do use it a lot in this. But again, it's all pretty optional. Against me of routers, I'm cutting a jig here. I made the jig I believe it was 3 inches wider on each dimension than the template that I made, so that I could actually router the dice trays. If you don't have a router, there's other ways to make dice trays. You can watch the other table building video I used that just cut straight through and then put some trim around the dice trays. Because I was working with oak, which is a beautiful wood, I decided I would router the dice trays. So you do that by making this jig, again 3 inches wider than what you're doing. You center it on there, you clamp it on there, and then you use a 3/4 cove bit, make a couple passes. I think I used maybe 3 passes. No, it was just 2 passes, cutting the rounded edges of it. Then you change that to a straight bit, and you just carve out the middle of it. The straight bit, I think I did use 3 passes on the straight bit. Again, changing bits is time consuming. Making sure everything is exactly the right height so it doesn't dig too deep into it is time consuming, but you end up with something that's really quite lovely because it's literally carved right into the surface of the wood. So I don't think I filmed all of me doing this because I spent a whole day just carving these. The actual carving, as you see, is pretty quick, but then you have to you adjust it, do another one, adjust it, do another one, change the bit, do another one, adjust, all those sort of things, and every time you have to make sure everything is perfectly clamped. But the jig allows you to carve that out, and it's very regular each time because the jig holds the edges of the router plate in place. So if you're used to using a router, it can produce some lovely effects. Or if not, it's a fun tool to use. You have to be careful with it. But if you can do a little work to learn it, it can lead to a lovely effect. I do several router pieces here. The only bits I use are a 3/4 cove bit to make the sort of rounded corners of this, and also those lark's tongue grooves. I use a straight bit for cutting out the cup holders and carving out the middle of the trays here, and I use a Roman OG bit for the edge of the table. Now that I've carved all those things, I'm just sanding down some edges that were sticking out a bit so that I can then make sure everything is lined up properly. And in doing so, I realized, this one miter isn't right. So what I did there, you see a glimpse of, is me cutting another piece of oak to sort of shim in between where the miter wasn't there, because you do want to make sure, if you get 3 of your miters perfect and that leaves the 4th one undone, you can cut a small piece. It's not perfect, but it's better than if you don't have another piece of wood redoing the whole face. So you see me now using wood glue and the nail gun just to nail these play surfaces onto the tops of the inner wall on one side, the facing on the other side, and then the cubes really bear the most of the weight. And again, to those cubes on each side are supported to the stiles and the undercarriage. What I'm now doing, I didn't get a good shot of this, as I'm taking one by one trim, cutting it to the size of the insides of that play vault. I'm mitering it 45 degrees, so as you can see there, it just gets glued and nail gunned to the inside, making a little ledge that runs around the inside of the vault. I'm sorry I didn't get better footage of that. And now I'm just filling. There was a lot of holes in this. I'm filling up with wood fill. Certainly, your nail heads, when you use the nail gun, are going to need that. This pine came from a tree in my friend's front yard, so it had several ash borers or whatever the thing is that made the holes in the oak, so I'm having to fill those up, number of knots, and then your miters might need to be filled a little bit too. And then you just sand it. Use 220 grit. You'll be doing a lot of sanding on this project. Yeah, so just fill, and then once you've sanded, you use a tack cloth to tack it all up. Now I'm creating the tabletop. This is optional if you just want a gaming table, but this was a dining table first and foremost. So again, these are 12-inch panels. Ideally, you'll use 8 12-inch panels. These were actually 10-inch panels, so I had to have some smaller panels in there. And you're just cutting them to the size of the table, which is ideally 3 feet 11 inches, although there may be a little tiny bit of variation. And then you are making joints for those. So you're using 1x4. You will glue and nail gun it to one of those pieces, and then you will glue and nail gun the other piece to that, and clamp it together. It look like that. You're basically making a half lap joint in that you have the 1x4 overlapping, and then you're gluing it together on the short face to short face with the tabletop, but you're also gluing and nail gunning from the bottom. What I'm doing here is I'm using the router to cut just a little bit of a curve into the tabletop pieces above where those cup holders go, so that they can sit more readily. You'll notice that I should have done this before I did the half lap joint on that, so I'm having a little bit of trouble with getting the router to dig deep enough. I actually bring in my Dremel the next day to cut that. Again, this is entirely optional. It just helps it sit a little bit more flush to have those little circles where the cup holders are. And now I'm routering. This is a decorative step. The edge, this is a Roman ogee. Just go around the edge with the router and that bit, and it wipe it off, sand it off a bit, tack it, and it makes this beautiful edge that makes it really look like actual furniture rather than just wood. Again, it's optional, but it's a really nice edge there. You're going to see that I do the tabletop, the gluing and joining. You'll see me do that several times here. I didn't have enough clamps, so I had to do it over several days, so it's sort of split up. But you can see that the decorative edge there, the Roman ogee. You can see I've now got 2 of the tabletop pieces are there. Here's me doing it again. Again, you're gluing the 1x4 to one of these, nail gunning it in, and then nail gunning the other. I think I had already glued those 2 tabletop pieces face to face. So you're going to end up with 4 planks that each have 2 pieces on them, and then the 1x4, it sits there in that little lip that you made around the vault, and it holds the pieces in place. Here I am sanding like crazy. Oh no, this isn't sanding. I'm putting I'm routering an edge around this. I just used a 3/4 roundover, both the top and the bottom of this. Again, it just makes it look like real furniture, as opposed to, a better shot of it later, just some planks that you had set on there. And it also gives a nice little lip where you can reach under the tabletops, pull them off, between the bit I carved into the edge of the play surface and then that roundover on that. Again, I used oak for this. It's lovely. It's not going to bend. It's very beautiful. Takes the stain wonderfully. It's very expensive, so if you don't have oak, don't worry about that. Pine is just fine with this. So here I am sanding. There is a lot of time that is spent in the finish of this table, which I think I enjoy finishing work a lot more than the actual construction work. So you'll see a lot of steps of finishing. So this is again just sanding every surface with 220 Every surface, once it's sanded, even the undersides there, because people can put their hands there. Once it's sanded, it gets tacked with a tack cloth. I realized there were some additional places that I needed to fill, so those get filled and resanded as well. Sometimes your miters might take a little wood fill. Wood fill, it's not the most professional thing in the world, but it covers a multitude of sins. So that's one of the miters there at the top. You can see there's some wood fill that I needed to make it line up nicely. And there's that round over edge on uh, the tabletop pieces. And again, it looks just awfully professional. It's so simple. Once you have a little bit of practice with a router, it really it's very simple to do. You saw how fast it was, and you see how sort of nice it makes the whole thing look. So again, now just more sanding. The tabletops get sanded both sides. The edges get sanded all the way around. In some cases, I needed to do one of the pieces didn't exactly sand. Wasn't exactly level when I had glued them together, and so I had to sand them with some 80 grit to actually do some shaping. And I actually had I think you just saw me rerouter the edge. And then, shop vac is very useful too. You see how much dust there is. There's not an area in my shop there that wasn't completely covered with dust. This is actually the theater where I teach, which is also my shop. So once it's sanded, again, everything gets tacked down. You'll go through a couple packages of tack cloth on this because you want to make sure you get all that dust from every surface before you actually start with the finishing. Really can't express enough that dust is your enemy, and dust is your constant companion through this, no matter how often you use that shop vac. And then this is an optional step. I did it partly because there was so much dust. I pre-treated the wood. This is just a Minimax pre-treatment. It's supposed to open up the pores. I honestly don't know how useful it is, but it did seem to sort of just clear off some of the dust that was still adhering to the wood. I just put a coat on it. It dries over 15 minutes. Now note, I'm going to be using the Minimax Polish shades. It's a one-step stain and poly. More advanced woodworkers really hate this stuff. They do not like it at all. It's what I've used on the 3 tables I've built. I've had really good results with it. But if you are a more experienced woodworker and you want to do your stain in 2 steps, do a regular stain and then a poly coat after it, and you know how to do that, if you don't know how to do that and want to watch a video on that, that's totally great. I'm just using this because it's what I've always used and I've had good results with it, and it is comparatively easy. That's the next step. You'll see me doing that, but that's entirely up to you. I've had good luck with it, but people who really know woodworking tend to really look down on the all-in-one poly shades stain there. Again, I'm just pre-treating it. By the time you've pre-treated every surface, your initial surfaces will be completely dry and ready for the stain. Note, I did this, the way I've scheduled this out, you can do this in about 8 days of work. Mine took 12 days because I needed time for glue to dry, and I only had so many clamps, and I got started late on the stain. But you can probably get it done in 8 or 9 days. It took me 12. With the polyshade stain, if you are using it, because it is a combination of a stain and a poly, you're going to apply a thin coat, and then you will what we call tip off, and that is just run the edges of the brush, light pressure, 45-degree angle away from the wood, and just run them all in a straight line, and that's just going to smooth everything out, get rid of any bubbles in the poly of it. And as you see, everything's going to the oak is going to get 2 coats over 2 days. The pine, so it matches the oak, is going to get 3 coats on that 3rd day. But that's, as you see, it's starting to take the stain, starting to look, the oak is just beautiful with the stain. This is me staining the bottom sides of the tabletop pieces the next day because I didn't wasn't able to do them both the same day. This is the before you do the second coat of stain, this is important. You want 3-0 steel wool and a tack cloth and a regular cloth, and you just want to go over everything with the steel wool, get it so it's nice and smooth, tack it all down before you go on with your next coat of stain. And it's the question is, is that really necessary? Well, with with other sorts of staining, it may not be. If you are using the poly shades, this is actually really important to get the really lovely finish that you want with it. So everything just gets sanded down with 000 steel wool. It gets wiped off with regular cloth. It gets tacked down with a tack cloth to get any of that dust, and you just do that with everything. I literally spent almost as much time, maybe even more time, on the finishing steps of this table than the construction. Maybe that's not as important to you, but I know this was it's meant to be a dining table, not just a gaming table, and so I really want to get that finish right. Making sure you're getting the edges as well, because those rounded over edges are important. And here I am applying that second coat of stain, having first done all the sanding and the tacking with the steel wool. Again, like I said, all the oak faces get 2 coats. This is just a natural oak stain. All of the pine got 3 coats to try to bring the pine up to about the same color as the oak. Again, you don't need to use oak. Oak is expensive, but it is lovely. Now I'm putting in the electrics here. You begin by installing just a basic socket underneath the table connected to a appliance cord that will run down one of the legs of the table so that the table can be plugged in. That socket is where you'll be plugging the LEDs in, and then you run another wire out of that socket. There you see there's the socket, there's the box, and with the cord running in and the second cord running out, it just gets mounted to the underside of the table there. And then you're going to run, I actually used USB outlets here. With a USB outlet, you can't put them in series. You can only run a cable in. So in each case, I ran the cable to the USB outlet, put it into the outlet box on the outside, and then those 3 cables, the one coming from the socket, that main socket you just saw, and then the 2 coming from the 2 USB outlets, meet at a little junction box in the middle. You'll see that. It's not hard to do this. Just watch. There's a couple of YouTube videos I'll link about how to wire up sockets. It's really pretty simple. I didn't even use wire nuts. I just used the little type of connectors where you just slide the piece in. There's LEDs around there. I didn't get footage of me putting the LEDs in. But they run under that ledge that you see around. I'll mention it more in a moment. The vault floor is neoprene. It's 2mm neoprene. You saw I was outside because you want to make sure you cut it initially in a place that's not covered with dust. So I cut it outside. Again, 6x3. Laid in the vault, and you want to center it, and you're going to find that it's not perfect. So you just use a sharp X-Acto knife or box cutter to cut those edges. Now I'm putting in 3/4 round trim that I'm mitering. That goes around the bottom to sort of hide those edges of that. Before you've done that, you will have put in your LEDs, just regular strip lights, along the bottom edge of that little ridge, the 1x ridge that you put in earlier, and that will shine down onto this 3/4 round trim, and that will be reflected onto the play surface. I used Philips Hue lights for this one. I don't really recommend them. They're very expensive. They're rather harder to install. Just the regular, $30 LEDs off Amazon work just great for this particular project. Notice, by the way, I've also put socket covers on. Didn't get footage of that step, but those of course go around the sockets. And I'm just mitering the edges to make sure all of those pieces fit, and then they get nail gunned into place there around that bottom edge, and you can see the LEDs. There's just a bit of adhesive, by the way, on the vault floor holding the neoprene in. So yeah, so that is the table that I built. Oh, there's one more important step here. It's actually, I think it's maybe the most important step, and it is a little time consuming, but you can see all the table there. And that is to go over everything again with now 4-0 steel wool, tack cloth, no, sorry, not a tack cloth, 4-0 steel wool, and Minimax finishing paste. So you just cover everything with a layer of that using the steel wool to apply it, which both sands down the previous layer and lubricates it with the finishing wax. Once you've done all of that, it takes about 50 minutes to dry, then you go back over the whole thing again with the 4-0 steel wool, and that polishes that wax to this wonderful touchable sheen. It just makes it really feel like real furniture. This completely smooth, completely satin finish. It really is. It's my favorite part of this whole process, is creating that wonderful, wonderful finish. And you just need steel wool and and Minimax finishing paste. I'll put some videos about that here as well. So that is the table. It is 4 feet wide in total and 7 feet long in total. The play surface is 3 by 6. It can easily seat 10 people, although there are, again, dice trays and cup holders for 6. LEDs around the inside. You see the edge there with the Roman OG carving and the carved-in dice trays. The cost of this is about $600 for materials. Again, it's more expensive if you want the Philips LED LEDs, if you want the oak facing, which is awfully nice. That's much more expensive if you want to go that direction. But it's about $600 for parts otherwise. The plans, the materials list, the sketches are all linked below. Again, I will point out I'm very much an amateur woodworker. Those of you who know woodworking, I'm sure, have a lot better ideas how you could do this piece, how you could do it both easier and better. I certainly welcome those in the comments. But I think the important thing is that this was a do-it-yourself project. So if you are not a accomplished woodworker, you can still make a dining table slash gaming table. It's really quite beautiful, very sturdy because of the undercarriage there. I think it's a nice piece. So I do hope you have some fun potentially building with this.